Welcome to Week Old Beans episode. What are we, 30, 31? I think we're 30. I'm gonna say we're 30. I'm gonna say that that's what we
I
are.
love how every episode you give the specific episode number, but that you never check. Like you could fix the problem by either checking or just saying, "Welcome to this week's episode," and then you'd be fine.
Well, I like accuracy, but I don't. I always tell myself I gotta check the episode number, but then I never do it. So we're gonna just be here together as one people. And then if you have your YouTube open, you can look and see what episode we're on. So you can do some legwork as a viewer instead of fucking being dependent on us. Jesus Christ. Anyway, Fowler. This is Fowler. Guys, this is Fowler. I'm Ardot. We're your two hosts. I got to start this episode because I think we need to go through this with our viewers, Fowler. I need to inform you guys something I discovered yesterday at like midnight. And that is the favorite foods of America's 50 presidents. I think we should do a whole episode on this, Fowler, but we got like real politics to talk about, so. But I think we could have a whole episode just going through this list. Obviously we got.
There's only three. I could never do a full episode. I have three takes. The best presidents, most of them enjoy steak, of course, because they're real men. Ronald Reagan, he's a fucking child, and you could tell by his food choice. And Richard Nixon, I would also carpet bomb Cambodians and like rob the Democrats and also be an alcoholic if I ate what he ate for breakfast or every morning. So it makes sense. I'm no longer hard on Richard Nixon. I honestly think, given the foods he was consuming and his kind of personal taste, that like we're just lucky he didn't do a Holocaust, because like lesser man would have cracked.
True. I actually made the first one because it's funny. George Washington's favorite food was hoe cakes. For those of you who don't know, hoe cakes are basically pancakes but with cornmeal instead of flour, because corn, big staple crop, especially in Virginia in the South, because of Native Americans. Just to give you an idea of what Fowler's talking about. Nixon's favorite food was cottage cheese with ketchup. Absolutely diabolical. Absolutely evil. I would kill myself if anybody made me try to eat that. And I think that recipe should be listed on a register of things that you could use in Guantanamo Bay to torture confessions out of unsuspecting prisoners. But that's just me. That is just me.
I'd also be drunk 24/7 if I had to eat that for my breakfast. So, respect for Richard Nixon.
Yeah. Yeah, respect for that. Anyway, and also Reagan's favorite food was jelly beans. Which is he like 8? Like what? I don't understand. Anyway, on to the actual topic of the day, which is not the favorite foods of the president, but something even worse. Are we doing counter narratives or are we doing Steve Bannon? I forgot. You tell me. What did we agree on before we started the podcast?
You said you'd lead and we'd do counter narratives.
Shit, I did say that, didn't I? Oh fuck. Okay. Counter narratives. What are they? Counter narratives are basically narratives that we tell ourselves that go against the hegemonic opinion of the time. Fowler and I, this was like 2 weeks ago, we had a really interesting discussion about counter narratives because we started. What do you remember? What topic we were talking about that we started talking about counter narratives? Was it Southern history?
No, we were talking about I'm German, and we were talking about like the reaction that Germans had after World War II, and how a lot of German communities in Europe and America, they propped up specific German figures in religion, in intelligence, and in the military and civilians who like were examples of how not all the Germans bend to the Nazis. And actually, there were a lot of Germans, including very powerful, prominent Germans, who kind of fought back. And we were
Like your
talking
boy
about like
Stauffenberg, baby. Sorry, I did give a shout out to my boy Stauffenberg. Look him up if you know. He was a real one. He was a real one. We salute Stauffenberg. Um,
he's played as Ted Cruz in the Valhalla movie, and I think Ted Cruz
Ted
is less
Cruz.
hot than
You
the
mean
real looking
Tom
guy.
Cruise?
Or not Tom
I was like, yo, what the fuck? Tom Cruise.
Listen, all white people look the same to me, okay?
That's racist, dude. That's racism right there. You just did a racism. All right.
Listen, the next generation of Germans, they'll talk about this comment of their children and they'll be like, not all German Americans thought that way. Here are other Germans who would never say such a
thing. Anywho, oh, what the fuck was I gonna say? But yeah, we basically like, yeah. Continue. You were talking. I was making jokes, interrupting you.
No, I'm done. That
Oh
was what
shit.
the topic of our conversation was about.
Yeah,
we could restart the filming if you want to like think a little, but I thought you were
No, no,
ready.
no. I'm prepared. All right. No, no, no. We don't. Not in my house, baby. We don't fucking restart shit in the house of Ardai here. Okay. No, I remember the conversation we had. So for those of you who don't know, because I think we have to give some context to this, because I think you know a lot of people. I had some realizations about history and about the way that in 2024 we've gone about sort of explaining our history. And one of the, and Fowler gave a really good example of Germany post World War II about how, you gave a specific example. You said it was, what's his face? It wasn't, it was Rommel, right? About the sort of dangers of different types of counter narratives and the necessity of certain types of counter narratives.
We were talking about Rommel and Canaris, with Rommel being a war hero from World War One. He fought in Africa during World War II, and he was, he didn't do the Holocaust. He wasn't doing a lot of the war crimes, and so he was propped up by Americans, Europeans, and Germans as basically being like the honorable German general. Like of example of the military being good. And then Canaris was an intelligence guy, and he gave the British intelligence that helped them basically win the war. He used his diplomatic skills to keep Spain out of the conflict on the side of the Axis, and he kind of helped Jews escape. And he is also propped up as like an example of like how intelligence figures within the government were not pro-Nazi. But I was saying like they're very complicated figures to back in a lot of ways, because Canaris and Rommel were both really far right. Neither of them really believed in democracy. Rommel very much backed Hitler. He didn't really have a problem with a lot of the things Hitler did until Hitler started losing. And Canaris was sort of similar. I mean, Canaris used, like, when his early career was killing communists and liberals in the Weimar Republic in order to, like, undemocratically, through terrorism, shift the far right into power. And he also didn't really have a problem with, like, the ramping up of the German military. He just drew a line at, like, the Holocaust and, like, wiping out the entirety of continental Europe. And, like, if they were in any other context, like if Rommel and Canaris had been in any other country besides Nazi Germany, they would undeniably be like one of the most evil and dangerous people in that country.
Yeah, and so, there was a counter narrative that was created around these two figures after the war. In large part because I think, when you talk about an event as dark and as horrible as the Holocaust and the cost of World War II, it is understandable why different people would, or at the very least why populations would, um, would begin to reevaluate some of the figures as a way, at the very least, to not present themselves as evil. I think, Fowler, you said, you told a story about how German Americans in the United States were very invested in, creating a sort of counter narrative that would, allow them to not be viewed as enemies of the state, or enemies of America after the war. And I think,
Mhm.
and I think that's, there are certain narratives that we learn, right? I don't even want to say narratives that we tell ourselves. If we tell ourselves the narratives, then they're oftentimes because that we've had them reinforced. Um, like, and so when Fowler and I had this conversation, I started to think about counter narratives in the South, right? And I started to think about, obviously Southern history is very bloody, very, very, contentious. There's a lot of racial tension. There's been a lot of bad things that have happened in the South, and we've created a counter narrative about the Civil War, the Lost Cause. We had an episode on that talking about the history of the Lost Cause. There's a whole counter narrative that was created after Reconstruction or during Reconstruction that was used to sort of rehabilitate the image of the South, right? And I think that the desire to do that is understandable, but it comes at a cost oftentimes. And I think the problem with the Southern counter narrative is that it was created by you know white supremacist former plantation owners. The Union after the war kind of allowed the former Confederates to re-enter the government and take power in the state that the states that they had previously waged war against the Union. And I think that and I think that a lot of the tension, at least from what I've seen in the South and even in the rest of the United States, right? Like I think that this is an issue that can be applied everywhere in America because America, the summer of 2020, as everybody knows, there were the George Floyd riots, there was BLM, there was this big sort of powder keg that went off, and it went off beforehand. It had been going off, but the explosion finally happened. And I think there's been a lot of weird nihilism I've seen towards the United States, in large part because, depending on where you are, I think the South especially, we've dismantled the counter narratives, right? But what we've failed to really do is establish new counter narratives to replace the ones that we've stripped away, and we've kind of just left this. I don't want to say a gaping hole, but we've kind of just left this, left everything settled, and we're not really giving people something that they can a history that they can look at and sort of view as positive. Um, and I think that's the importance of counter narratives. It's not so much that you lie. I mean, I think all history is to some extent mythologized and manipulated. And the question is, how do you manipulate that history? Like, this is not really a
And
moral
what your
question.
goals are,
Yeah, and what
what
you're
elements
exactly.
of your culture you're propping up, and what those implications are.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think I said it on this podcast, but I told Fowler this, but like the whole idea of America being a nation of immigrants, that was a counter narrative that was created by the Kennedy administration. Um, and there are issues with that counter narrative, most notably that it just, for the most part, ignores the fact that no, 45 million Black Americans were not immigrants to the United States, and the remaining 5 million Native Americans, who were massacred over the course of 200 years, were also non immigrants. So that's a counter narrative that, depending on who you speak with, people take issue with, but it's become such a hegemonic idea, even since what, the 60s, that was JFK. Um,
Hmm.
60s, 70s, that it's become like kind of the hegemonic opinion of the United States. You talk to anybody, and well, America's a nation of immigrants. No, it's not, like, um, but
Most
again,
counter narratives are not, I think, designed for everyone. Like, I think
yeah,
that's a rare example of it becoming like hegemonic. I mean, like the German narrative or like some of the Southern narratives about the lost cause. Like those narratives are very specifically designed for like specific regions, specific ethnicities, and I think that's where a lot of those counter narratives actually exist.
Yeah,
Is they quietly exist inside very specific subcultures of a country, and
yeah,
they're very powerful within those subcultures. But often the mainstream is
not picking it up.
not aware.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
I think a really good example of this, and I think this is true in a country as big as the United States, like, you know, um, America's so big. I mean, there's never been a united American opinion. A lot of the idea of, make America great again, going back to when America was all the same, is a lot of that's, again, a lie. I mean, that's a very specifically crafted narrative. There's, I'm going to steal from Destiny here. I say what you will about him, but he said something I think is rather important during a debate with, I can't remember who it was. But he said, like, the reason why we feel so divided now is in large part because, 100 years ago, a New Mexico rancher, and a, New York stockbroker never talked to each other. They lived completely separate lives, completely, had a completely separate culture, a completely separate, probably ideology. Things impacted them differently. Their economy, everything was different. This is the first time in American history where we're on this national level and people can, communicate with one another, directly. Whereas, so all these subcultures, I mean, people say, well, America is polarized and divided. And I think we are divided on the basis of politics, but this idea of there being a unified American culture that's never been the case. That is a very specific narrative that is perpetuated by very specific people. Somebody in fucking California and somebody in, Tennessee or Alabama, live very different lives. Even if they're of the same, race, quote unquote, a white Californian and a white Alabamian,
well, I think a lot of
like,
that is that there was no need. Well, you could argue there's always a need, but there was less of an obvious need to understand the national story when the state governments were more powerful and the federal government was much global corporations, where the federal government is more powerful than it's ever been with the surveillance state and just its means, the sheer amount of money.
Fowler's dying. Rip Fowler. But yeah, no, he's basically making the argument that, the national story was not as important back when America was, when the states primarily had more power and the federal government did not. Which is most definitely a an absolutely fair point. Um Absolutely fair point to make. Sorry, Fowler, I was just explaining what you had said because you cut off a little bit, but
No
um
worries.
um yeah, no, that is that's a fair point. That's you're right. Yeah, like, this is most definitely a symptom of modernity. It was probably going to happen again. Like this is not something that was ever not going to occur with the expansion of technology, this expansion of communications and stuff like that. So, um, but I think a really good example of what Fowler was talking about when it came to the different counter narratives being regional. If y'all remember when Nikki Haley was asked about what the Civil War was about in South Carolina, she said, she didn't say slavery. She refrained from saying slavery, and Fowler and I did an episode talking about the lost cause, talking about that. One of the things that Trump said, and I think it makes sense why he would believe this, because if you remember, Trump was born and raised and educated in New York State. Um, Trump very, kind of very obviously, laughed at her and said, obviously the Civil War was about slavery. Like, that's a no brainer. And, you know, um, people cheered him on for that. And, you know, Fowler made the point that he has no reason to appeal to neo Confederates. But one of the things that I said is I was like, well, it's probably a symptom of his education. I mean, if he was educated, raised in New York State, they're not going to teach the lost cause in New York. They're going to teach, what the Civil War was actually about, which was the ability for states to, have slaves and regulate the slave trade. Um, the states' rights to regulate the slave trade and keep the slave trade. Um, you know, Trump would have no reason to not believe that, considering that I'm sure his education did not teach him the counter narrative that is taught down in the South, which is that, um, slavery was a contentious issue about states' rights. I got taught that it was about building a railroad. I don't know about y'all who are listening, but they taught us that it was about building a railroad. Um, so I think there are different. I think the thing about counter narratives that you have to sort of keep in mind is that, like, they are, like Fowler said, they are, regional. And I think as America becomes more national, um, the question really is, as the country becomes more nationalized, is like, okay, how do we manage to offer counter narratives that are all encompassing? And I think a lot of the nihilism, especially in the South, is that, like, if you hammer that a people are bad and you hammer that your history is bad and you don't offer a suitable counter narrative, people are going to feel defensive. People are going to feel upset. You know what I mean? People hold on to their history in large part because if they're not offered something else to replace it that is positive, um, they feel like they're under siege.
I think that can be true. It's definitely a careful balance between like not making people feel like you're attacking their identity and their history and their community, while also pointing out the very real contradictions and horrors of your country. I think the German stories that I grew up with are very different in a sense from like the Southern narrative, because the Southern counter narrative never really is honest about the reality of what actually happened
Yeah,
and what they are responsible for, and how the Southern lost cause myth, there are very large parts of the South that are not included in that narrative. And I think, I have my quibbles about certain figures like Canaris or, Rommel, but like there is kind of an element of that where they do admit that Nazism is evil, and they do admit that like enough of the Germans were Nazis that they like it was significant and it was totalizing. Um, but walking that line is incredibly difficult because I think um, like when we're talking about identity, and I think this is something that's not made very nuanced when people talk about identity politics. And if people use the term identity politics, they generally mean it like in a negative sense. Like there are times where like being black or being white or being an immigrant or being Jewish, like those identities are under attack. And when we're talking about identity politics, we really do mean that like those cultures, those communities, those people, like the messaging is that they are like evil or subversive or wrong. But I think we also have to recognize that like for some people, Jordan Peterson is a great example of this. Like even bringing up real problems like sexism, like racism, like anti-Semitism, like to those people, and there are a lot of them, like even bringing up flaws in their counter narratives is an attack on themselves. Admitting that like there is racism, admitting that like you do have a one up if you're a man. These are all things that, people respond incredibly violently to.
yeah. Well, I think in America, we live in a culture where people don't like. I mean, I think this is true for everybody. People don't like to feel patronized. People don't like to feel as if you're discounting their accomplishments and what they view as their hard work. And I think, when you offer up very real critiques of, certain identities that have elements of misogyny, elements of racism, elements of you know, elements of anti-Semitism, like you're not attacking them. You're not implying that that they're not, successful or good because they didn't try. You're pointing out something that really is a hindrance, I think. And I think the Southern story is like this because I think, so much of Southern history is, different, especially when you get to the Deep South. Like, like so much progress was lost in the South because of the racism, because, like wealthy Southern leaders were able to take advantage of the vast amounts of income inequality that exists in the region and manipulate people into oftentimes, voting against their own self-interest, and perpetuating a divide that doesn't help anybody. I mean, a really good example of this, I think, is Mobile, Alabama, prior to its acquisition by the United States, and New Orleans as well. Mobile, Alabama was a massive, massive metropolitan center in Alabama when it was, I believe it was French. It was a French territory. It was French Alabama, French Mississippi, French Louisiana. There was a massive, massive class of free people of color and Creole people because if anybody knows about the way the French and the Spanish went about their sort of, it was still racism, but their color divide, it was much more based on class. There was a buffer class of mixed race, French, Spanish, African native people that lived in New Orleans and lived in Mobile, Alabama. Um, and it was a major, major center for trade. People from all over, people from the United Kingdom, people from France, everybody sort of coexisted. The Creoles owned land. They were landowners. Many of them were slave owners. But there wasn't really that color divide, and the economy was thriving in both New Orleans and Mobile. And what happened is that when the United States acquired Alabama, um, a lot of the really toxic, racial ideology that America had been perpetuating, which was that black and white color divide, encroached upon the Creole communities in Mobile, and eventually the enforced segregation and the sort of the removal of the Creole identity, the forcing Creoles to identify as black or white based on their phenotype, which was not something that they were used to. So you had situations where you could have people within the same family who had to separate because maybe your cousin was white, but you had the phenotype of an African and you could not cohabitate or be together, as family. Many of
Well,
them passed as white, and many of them,
I think, oh, sorry.
oh, I was going to say, to get to my point, the enforcement of those policies, that the segregation that bled from, the different, southern states at the time, it destroyed Mobile's economy. Many of those Creoles were professionals. They were people who worked in business, who worked in finance, who worked as landowners, and they were stripped. They were not allowed to practice they were not allowed to contribute to the economy of these, places. New Orleans too. New Orleans had the exact same thing happen, and it devastated their economy. And I think, like, this is Mobile, Alabama. I mean, this is, Alabama has a terrible. There's a perception of Alabama that's very negative, and but prior to it being acquired by the U.S., it was the dominant economic center of the non-American territory, and it never recovered.
Well, it has to be remembered with counter narratives that I mean, narratives in general, they benefit certain people within that in group more than others.
Yeah,
I mean, you can see this with nationalism, where, you know, the weapons contractors, the politicians, they're not the ones dying in the trenches. It's the working people that get drafted. I think you can see this with this other narrative and how there's a glorification of this landowning aristocracy that props them up into power. And I think this is like, there are cases like Mobile, Alabama, where the counter narrative is just completely toxic and like it's so delusional and wrong headed that it simply just destroys everyone. But I think the more common position is that the counter narrative binds together people who, some of whom are not benefited from the counter narrative, and some of whom, like the counter narrative, its implications don't make their lives better, but the narrative is strong enough anyway that it it forces them kind of into it
Yeah,
anyway.
well, and it gives you, and I think in a country like in a place where there was abject slavery, I think it's very difficult because the so much of the narrative was fear. I mean, so much of what drove poor white Southerners to identify with the aristocracy who didn't give a fuck about them. Um, so much of that was this fear of retribution, this counter narrative about the fear of retribution. The fear of the anger over the loss of what if you were poor, I mean, there's always the chance it's highly unlikely, but there was always the chance that you could become rich, and during slavery, if you wanted to be rich, you had to own slaves. Um, so getting rid of that institution, even if you were someone who didn't own slaves, your children might, get rich off the labor of others, and you want to defend that institution because it protects you from what you don't know, and it also could be of use to you in the future. Um,
Another very interesting example of a counter narrative who became hegemonic is a lot of Reagan's ideas. Like, working people were Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, you kind of welfare programs, making college affordable, backing unions, and strengthening labor. But the Reagan Revolution, where he kind of convinced a lot of the populace that government was a problem and that deregulation would make people more free, and a lot of the lowering taxes. I mean, all that stuff, lowering taxes for the wealthy mainly. I mean, that stuff did not benefit the average person
yeah.
who voted for Ronald Reagan. It benefited like Joe Schmo is not being destroyed by a lot of these regulations. It was the billionaires and millionaires backing Ronald Reagan who really benefited in the same way that his dismantling of the state and kind of weakening it, he did that very selectively. He dismantled the parts of the state that helped poor people and helped black people. He didn't dismantle the parts of the state that gave all of the subsidies to the industries that were funding his campaigns. He didn't stop the imperialism or the expansion of American power into other countries undemocratically. It was a counter narrative that was very selectively useful to only a few key elements of the overall group, that counter narrative, who believed in that counter narrative.
So I want to use another historical example of somebody who I think I think I find him fascinating. Fowler knows about my fascination with Zephaniah Kingsley. I've not talked about him on the podcast because I think he is a really difficult character to kind of get into. Um, if you're from Florida, you probably know who he is. I know Florida history touches on him a lot more because he was mainly situated in Florida. Um, he became famous in Florida. So Zephaniah Kingsley, for those who don't know, he was lucrative, not only a slave owner, but a slave trader. He actually went to, from what we know, he went to Africa and engaged in I don't know if he engaged in raids, but he most definitely was involved in the taking, shipping, and moving of enslaved Africans from Africa to the Caribbean and to the United States, which is a step farther. I mean, if you were a plantation owner in the South, for the most part, you probably inherited the people that you enslaved or you purchased them. You weren't participating in the actual legitimate going to Africa and getting slaves. So he was kind of out, not even out there, but he was more involved in the institution than probably the average plantation owner was at that time. And what I find interesting about Zephaniah Kingsley, people focus on the African woman that he took as his wife. She was 13 when he purchased her in Africa, and she was pregnant on the way back from, by the time they got to Africa, she was pregnant with her first child. He married her. He, you know, and he married three other black women, I believe. No white marriages, no white children. What's interesting about him to me is that at the time, obviously everybody knows the different narratives that were presented, the different count. I mean, I guess these were narratives, not so much counter narratives, but they were a narrative nonetheless. That were presented that basically post hoc justified slavery. By this point, Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia had been, I think, published and had been widely read, and that's where he lays out the fact that he believes that black people are genetically, mentally inferior. Um, the idea that Africans were basically just stupid and therefore could be enslaved was pretty much a common hegemony in the United States at the time. What I find interesting about Kingsley and why I think he's significant isn't because of the fact that he had a black wife, and that black wife had a lot of privileges, and she herself became, I think, after he passed, a slave trader and slave owner. It was the fact that he was very open about the fact that he was well aware that the narratives presented about the inferiority of Africans were not true, that it was simply a way to justify enslaving them. He was very pro African in a weird way. I mean, for a man of his time, he admitted that there was no inferiority or superiority of the different races. He admitted that he was just really involved in the financing aspect of the slave trade. He didn't necessarily do it because he felt like Africans were inferior and that they needed to be enslaved. Um, he detested religion. He did not convert any of the people he enslaved because he believed that like it did, like you didn't need to convert the people that you enslaved. So he was very anti-Christian. He practiced polygamy. He allowed his wife to practice her native customs. She lived in a separate room from him, which from her culture was the norm, right? Husband and wife did not live in the same room together. Um, and his openness about it made the rest of the American sort of plantation owning elite very uncomfortable. Um, Obviously he was, what he was doing was terrible. This is not to valorize him as an individual. Obviously, like, regardless of what you believe, like, human trafficking is not okay, just to go ahead and say. But the response he received from the plantation elite was one of, horror and scorn and disgust. And I think a lot of that was because he, without maybe intending to, destroyed their counter narrative. I mean, he sort of just revealed the underbelly of what slavery was, which was that it was just for profit. Like, he revealed you didn't need to really do any of the extracurricular shit to justify what you were doing. You didn't need to create a counter narrative to justify what you were doing, you know? And I think that made.
Well, at that point, it wasn't a counter narrative. The other plantation owners were the hegemony. He
Yeah,
was the
yeah,
counter
yeah. He
narrative.
was the counter narrative, right? Like, and it was apparently, I mean, he faced such hostility for the way he went about engaging in the slave trade that from what I do know, Andrew Jackson was going to appoint him governor of Florida when the territory was acquired, but didn't do it because of how controversial he was as a figure in Florida. Um, so I always just found that really interesting. It's so morbid and so horrible and so evil. And it's analyzed. The topic of conversation historically is his wife, Anna Kingsley. After he passed, she pretty much managed his estate because, again, remember, Florida was part of Spain. Spanish Florida, if you were a free person of color, you had a lot more freedom in Spanish Florida than you did if you were in the continental, or, the what at that point was the United States. Because the Spanish and the French, the way they engaged in the slave trade, the racialization was not as hardcore. The racialization in the U.S. racialization is very reminiscent of like the Anglo caste system, like very rigid. In Spain and France, you had a little bit more wiggle room. It was still shitty, you know, but there was more wiggle room, in that caste system, and there still is today if you go to Latin America. But yeah, Kingsley was the counter narrative at the time, and he sort of revealed, like I said, without meaning to, like, you know, you can just like you don't need to make up all this bullshit about black people being stupid, about them being, genetically predispositioned to being slave. Like, you can just fucking, and he was one of the wealthiest plantation owners at the time too. That's the other thing, is that his methods bore fruit. Like, he was making unbelievable amounts of money in Spanish Florida, more so than pretty much anybody in the South at the time. And that obviously probably made the plantation class uncomfortable because it showed that like the hegemony that they created was not only untrue, but it was like it didn't even work. You know,
Hmm. Savannah Kingsley is interesting because most counter narratives, in order to succeed in any way, you have to valorize the people who are supposed to believe in the counter narrative, like the Southern idea that like actually they were the best, warriors, and they had the best strategies, and they were self defending themselves. They were just like, outnumbered by impossible odds. Or, the idea of like, there were Germans who fought back, and Nazism was not so total and complete that it damned the entire country. I think a lot of the reasons why Kingsley didn't really succeed is his counter narrative doesn't make white people who participate in the slave trade feel better. It doesn't make them feel noble. It doesn't make them feel justified. All he did is strip away the hegemony without adding the element that would make it like compelling to other human beings.
Yeah, he was a controversial figure. He was the he there was he split the abolitionists of the time. Like there were some abolitionists who were very pro Kingsley, and then some who were very anti Kingsley, specifically because of what you just said. So that critique, interestingly, is a critique that was levied at him while he was still living. Um,
I think very few people. I mean, there are people like we see this with white nationalists. There are white nationalists who do understand that the race shit, the superiority, the victim complex, that stuff is bullshit. But I think they're the vast minority. I think most kind of ideologues of any stripe, they do need that veneer of civility, that veneer of justification, that veneer of justice. I think it's really, really hard to convince a huge amount of people to just perceive themselves in such a cutthroat and utilitarian way.
yeah, absolutely. Um, but yeah, yeah, we're done. I don't ever know how to end the podcast, Valor. I'm sorry. But yeah, I think counter narratives are important. I mean, one of the things I always say is I think we need to start really looking at ways to offer positive counter narratives. American history, as I've read more and more about it, is fascinating. I mean, the fact that we have so much history condensed in 400 years is absolutely incredible. And I think the fact that like we have so many different types of people living in this country is also fascinating. I think that any in any region of the United States, regardless of how brutal and evil the history is, because of the fact that our country is so diverse, you will find counter narratives, and I think it's the same for the South too. Um, you know what I mean? And perhaps we need to create those counter narratives. You know what I mean? Like history and reality. History is always being made. You know, each generation molds itself, um, and is the counter narrative for the next generation. I think you have to view it as you are participating in history. You are participating in building the counter narrative, and you want to make sure it's a good and positive one. You want it to be a positive counter narrative that you're working on building. So I think I have a pretty positive outlook about it.
We'll have to see. We're living in a time of great instability, and instability always is the time and place where um, powerful counter narratives have the opportunity to go mainstream.
Yeah, but thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see y'all in the next video. Podcast, not video.